I live in America, and we have these
It's a
supreme.
different world.
It's a little bit of a different world. Well, there might be a crossover here because our we're getting a new Supreme Court justice, and she
Yes.
was asked yesterday or the day before to define a woman, and
Yes.
she said she couldn't do that in that context because she's not a biologist. Now the Twitter back and forth, of course, is about how do you not know what a woman is, but
Mm.
specifically within America, and this is a big problem that people don't know about, the law hasn't made explicit what a woman is. It was taken as granted.
Mm. Yes.
Woman was just granted. And now that queer theory, gender ideology is having its way with our words, the law is now allowing woman to be a feeling or to be something that one identifies into. What you've been doing with your life is working with women to a greater or lesser extent, and a paper that you and some colleagues published was explicitly about why within the medical field sex language is important. So we can step out of the courtroom and into the classroom or the clinician's office for this discussion.
Sure. Although, I mean, that same question is being asked in lots of different places. It's been asked in Australia. It's been asked of many politicians in the UK that I've seen. Um, can I tell you what I wish somebody asked that question would say back? Because I wish that they would ask them, are you wanting a sexed definition or a gendered one? Because we are living in this world where there's more than one meaning of what is a woman. And if you're specific, then you can, I guess, use the language as and when appropriate. Because there'll be some times when you'll want to use it in a gendered sense, and there'll be some times when you want to use it in a sexed sense. And it's about working out when those times are. Yeah,
Limiting the equivocation.
exactly. Well, it's pointless, isn't it? You know, like, what did that answer give? Nothing. And if you're somebody who is working in the law, you need to be specific sometimes, just as you do in healthcare.
Mm-hmm. When did you get into this healthcare thing?
When I had a baby. So I don't know. You may think I'm a midwife or a nurse, but I'm not. My background's actually in agriculture, and I have a PhD in plant physiology. But I had a baby as a PhD student, and all of a sudden the plants weren't so interesting, and I got very interested in breastfeeding, and did a bit of field switch. So, which you can do with science. A PhD is an apprenticeship pretty much in undertaking science, and so you can move from area to area, and that's what I did.
I didn't want to be inappropriate, but I was just thinking about you stopped smelling the flowers and started studying the tits or something like that. Is that what happened? Like you just kind of switched your focus from how plants thrive and live to how human beings procreate and reproduce?
Well, no, I mean, it was really breastfeeding was the thing that I was interested in. It wasn't something that I really knew anything about until I had a baby,
Yeah.
and I became fascinated by it and moved across, slowly. But it's been an area that I've been working in now for 20 years or so,
Wow.
probably a bit more.
Okay. And you're a
Um,
professor, associate
I'm an
professor.
associate professor,
Yeah.
yeah, an adjunct associate professor.
Yeah.
So my work's a little bit broader than that now. It's not just breastfeeding, it's more infant feeding. And I also do work to do with adoption and foster care
Oh
and
wow.
childhood trauma. So,
Okay.
so a few different things.
So I guess we're going to talk about breastfeeding, at least for a little bit.
Sure.
What's up with it? Why is it? What does it do? What are some of the myths? Where do we begin when I guess a mother and maybe a mother and a father walk in? They want to understand, what is this thing? Should we do it? Should we not do it? What does it mean? What does it do?
Well, it's part of female reproduction. So it's actually, I think sometimes people think that that reproduction, starts with the sex act and ends with the birth of the baby, but actually, breastfeeding is a continuation. So when the baby's born, actually during pregnancy, there's preparation being made to feed this child when they're born. And when the baby's born, then other processes kick into place that mean that large amounts of milk are going to be produced in order to feed that child. And working within a lot of my work is within an international context. In places, particularly in places where sanitation is poor, where healthcare is scarce, where resources are few. Whether a baby is being exclusively breastfed or not has a massive impact on their chances of survival. It's about 800,000 or so children die each year because they're not being breastfed as they really need to be. So it's quite a big thing, and it becomes it's important everywhere. So even in wealthy countries, it makes a difference whether a baby is breastfed or not. But it's particularly the case when, like I say, resources are poor. And you can see what can happen when there's an emergency, because that's probably my main area of work is infant and young child feeding in emergencies. When there's an emergency and everything changes, so a resource-rich setting, like, for example, in Ukraine, can turn into something that is very, very resource poor. And in those circumstances, breastfeeding is more important. And there's a real need to actually ensure the safety of all of the infants, including those that aren't being breastfed, through targeted support, because they're really at risk. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if there's no longer a shop where you can buy formula, if there's no longer safe mains water that you can use to reconstitute infant formula or to wash, if you don't have health services easily available, if sanitation is poor, then you're in real trouble. And babies can't wait. They really need, an adult could just live on water for several days or Coke or whatever, like they don't have, we don't really have very specific food and fluid needs, but infants are in a very different position. So they're very vulnerable.
So there's a continuum between the baby being in the womb and being nurtured and cared for by the mother's body, and then being outside of the womb and still being nurtured and cared for by the body. So my question is there a big difference between what the placenta and amniotic fluid, if there's actual sustenance, nutrients going into the baby through that fluid, is there a difference between that system and the breast and what the breast is producing?
I mean, there's a massive difference. I mean, when an infant's born, they go through this incredible shift in terms of what they need to do to be alive. And when they're in utero, they're getting everything via the placenta.
Oxygen,
they don't have to breathe.
Sugars.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. They're being directly nurtured through the placenta and through the mother's blood, essentially. In some respects, that continues because milk is actually made out of blood. So, but it's not blood. So it's, it's a very unique fluid. It's not like anything else. So in some respects we'd say, yes, it's like blood. In other respects we say it's not like blood. I mean, they have all these discussions around, when they're talking about milk banking, which is where women express their milk. and it's processed and stored through some sort of medical facility, generally to be given to very premature infants, because those actually, I mean, I talked about who's vulnerable. Even in really resource-rich settings, infants that are very premature are very vulnerable, and if they don't have access to breast milk, they are at increased risk of serious illness and death. And so many hospitals and health systems around the world have breast milk banks to provide breast milk to these predominantly very fragile infants that have been born prematurely. And there's this whole discussion around how do you regulate regulatory systems and milk banking. You know, is this actually a food? Is it a medicine? Is it a human tissue? And in reality, it's all of those things. But how do we regulate it? How do we classify it? How do we work with it? So it gets a bit complex sometimes, and different places regulate it differently.
Yeah. So even a premature child, as soon as I guess there's a viability, a date where a child can't survive at all outside of the womb, but past that date, once they are outside of the womb, the body itself starts to, I guess the digestive system just kicks in, whereas before, where's the baby's digestive system while they're in the womb? What is it doing? Is it just waiting to activate?
Look, I mean, it is my understanding, and I'm absolutely not an expert. Like I say, I'm not a midwife. I'm not an expert on the inside stuff. I'm more an expert on the outside stuff. But babies do swallow amniotic fluid. So they do, like, their systems are doing some work to a degree, but they're getting their nutrition via the placenta. When they come out, obviously, yes, their lungs have to start working. They actually, their gut needs to start working as well. They start developing their microbiota, which is, the bacteria that we have, all over us and inside of us.
More than us, actually.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So that's where, even how they're being born can impact that. So whether they're being born by cesarean section or vaginally can have an impact on that. If they're being born vaginally, they're going to be getting in contact with their mother's microbiota, and that will help seed it. Whereas if they're being born by a cesarean section, they're more likely to sort of get seeded by hospital bacteria, which is not so fabulous. And there is a different sort of there, there's still relatively early days with research and this sort of thing, but they're wondering whether these sort of differences might explain some differences in disease outcomes and that sort of thing, where babies are born by a cesarean section or vaginally. And they also get bacteria through breast milk as well. So and also factors within the milk that actually foster the development of their own microbiota. So it's really complex.
Okay. There's a lot of science here.
Yes.
Does a mother's milk change based on the baby, like over time? Like her third child, her body's producing something that's a little bit more attenuated to the third child, whereas the first child had a slightly different milk?
Well, so there's a couple of things. So we talked about premature infants. So the milk that a woman produces when her baby has been born prematurely is different to the milk that a woman will produce if her baby is born at term. So it contains more of the sort of protective factors that and different composition of different nutrients. So it's better suited to a premature infant. But generally speaking, the milk changes over the lactation rather than between children.
Okay.
So you start off with the first milk, which is usually called colostrum. It's very concentrated, small volume, high level of anti-infective factors and growth factors.
What's a factor?
Is what the growth factors.
Yeah, what does the word factor mean? It's kind of opaque to me.
I think it's just kind of a replacement for things.
Okay.
Or ingredients, or
okay.
It doesn't mean anything in particular.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's a very, very, very complex fluid, which is why we've got it sort of 150 years or so of people attempting to emulate breast milk through the creation of infant formula. It's still not anything close to breast milk, although the marketing will tell people that it is. It is, especially early on in a child's life. My view is that it is more like a tissue than a food. So when you're trying to replace that with something else, it's, in terms of how it acts in the child's body, it is going to be inadequate because you've got this sort of dynamic living fluid that has thousands of ingredients that interacts with the body in many different ways. It's really difficult to try and make a replacement. So much like we have, they have developed blood replacements for people who need blood transfusions, but who, for religious or other reasons, aren't willing to have them. Mm-hmm. They're not very, they're nothing like the real thing. And so they're not used generally. They're only used when they really have no other choice. Mm-hmm. So, that's also the case with this. Yeah.
So how is milk created?
Oh, gosh. I don't know that I can explain that in a simple way.
I guess we need to have charts and stuff. But
yeah. It's made from the blood, and it's made in the breast. And if you're a human being, you have the capacity to make milk because both male and females have tissue in their breasts that's capable of making milk. But it's really during pregnancy that you have hormones that are acting on the breast that actually develop the structures within the breast to prepare them to make milk.
Oh, okay.
So estrogen, progesterone and prolactin all work together. And so from about sort of 15, 16 weeks of pregnancy, a woman will start to produce small amounts of milk in her breast. And if women are pregnant, they'll notice that their breasts will have gotten larger. They'll feel heavier. They'll feel hotter. They'll be able to potentially express drops of milk, which is not white. It'll be yellowy in coloration. And then when the baby is born and the placenta is removed, you get a large drop in progesterone because the progesterone has actually come from the placenta. And that triggers the beginning of the process to make large amounts of milk. And so sort of anywhere from 2 to sort of 5 days after birth, that's when women start making large amounts of milk, and they get very full breasts. Mm-hmm. And travel on from there. Yeah. So it starts out as an automatic process where the body is actually, will make, even if a woman has no intention of breastfeeding, her body is going to make milk after she gives birth. But it then actually moves to a supply and demand process. So the milk will only be made if it's being removed. So it's a process where the milk is removed and then more milk will be made. If the milk isn't removed, then the breasts get the message, this milk isn't needed, and gradually the milk production will shut down.
And that's probably accompanied by conscious pain, I assume.
If it's done quickly, it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if it's done
So,
slowly,
so
so
that
if it's a
you
gradual
wean the
process,
breast as you wean the child,
yes,
kind of thing.
exactly,
Oh, okay.
exactly. Yeah, it's not sort of recommended to stop cold turkey
Yeah.
because then you will have pain,
Yeah.
quite a lot of
Yeah.
it.
And you said that that the milk kind of changes composition over the course of time. So
Yes,
what's the, I know this is kind of a political or cultural issue about when do you cut the child off or when do you wean the child, let's
sure.
say. But the
Yep,
breast can do it indefinitely. I mean, you could get a
pretty
job as a wet
much.
nurse. It'll just keep on going.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it is really that supply and demand thing, and if the milk is being removed, then the milk will continue to be made. I mean, sort of as an aside, it's not absolutely necessary to have pregnancy in order to make milk, and so there've always been circumstances where, say, for an example, a woman has died during birth. It's still quite a common thing to happen around the world. And until fairly recently, if that happened, unless somebody else breastfed the baby, it was, almost a death sentence. And so we do have this backup mechanism, whereas, as I mentioned, there's all these hormones that develop the breast for lactation during pregnancy, but you can have just prolactin, just one of these hormones, can actually develop the breast tissue on its own.
Mm-hmm.
And prolactin is released through nipple stimulation. So just putting a baby to the breast or using a breast pump can actually develop the breast to make milk, and as starts off with small amounts of milk, and as the milk is removed, more milk will be made. And so that's how we get situations where if a mother's died, somebody else can, often the grandmother or an aunt, is able to breastfeed the baby. But we also see it, in other circumstances with adoptive breastfeeding and breastfeeding after surrogacy and that sort of thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Wow. The woman
Lots of flexibility.
yeah. The woman can do some amazing things on demand, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's not always easy, and that's, why. I mean, I guess that's one of the reasons why this is such a fraught topic, because a lot of women who want to breastfeed find that they experience difficulties that they're not able to overcome, and
Such
that's
as
very difficult for them. Oh, look, I mean, so, you're in the US, I'm in Australia. Lots of, I guess, wealthy countries kind of lost the knowledge around breastfeeding sort of from the middle of the 20th century. Infant formula companies were very successful in marketing their products as scientific, and therefore better than the homemade stuff, and so we had really, and they also engaged very successfully with the medical professionals in terms of educating them about their products. And as a result of that, a lot of knowledge around breastfeeding was lost. A large proportion of women didn't breastfeed at all, and so culturally, that we lost the knowledge and the practice, and so it's been, I think, from the early 1970s on, a real process of actually regaining that knowledge and regaining that culture, which hasn't happened completely. And so there's still, for a lot of women, they might not have even seen a baby being breastfed until they're handed their own. And that's a really bad time to learn about how to breastfeed, is when, to start to learn when you're first handed your baby. And so there's, I guess there's all sorts of challenges that women can face in feeding their infants, and in getting appropriate assistance from health professionals, because that still can be quite hard to find.
Oh, okay. Because the Western medical industry has still not really considered breastfeeding a important
Yeah, they
part of
don't. They
the.
have very generally low levels of knowledge about it. So, I think for most sort of general practitioners, doctors that deal with just families generally, for in Australia, and I think it is the same also in the US. Most of their knowledge will come from their personal experiences rather than anything that they've learnt through their training.
Oh.
And so if they've had extensive personal experience with breastfeeding, if they've breastfed their own child, if their partner has breastfed their children, then their level of knowledge is going to be much greater than if they haven't had children, or if they didn't breastfeed their children. Then they're going to struggle very often to actually help women. So, yeah. I mean, it's part of that we have this female data gap in research, medical research, where there hasn't been as much attention paid to women's health conditions and women's needs, and just women in research in general. I mean, we saw it with COVID-19. They didn't include pregnant and breastfeeding women in the vaccination trials, which meant that when the vaccines were being rolled out, women were having to make decisions about vaccination based on very little evidence. It's really quite astounding that this sort of thing is still happening. So, yeah.
Well, and then going back to the topic of the day, if we can't even define what a woman is, if the language for the female is erased, that further occludes knowledge gathering and transmission, because there's an extra couple steps, or even just verbal steps where instead of calling a woman, we called her a chest feeder or a menstruator, which is just on a linguistic level more cumbersome.
Yeah, I mean, like they're kind of two separate issues there, but we are seeing a decline in the collection of data on sex in research. So previously, we had just your ordinary everyday sexism that saw the male body as the standard and female bodies as just too complicated to bother with. Their hormones fluctuate, they get pregnant, they breastfeed. We don't want to have to control for all those variables. So we'll just do all our research on males. And this goes back, this is not just male humans. I mean, early drug research starts with cell lines and animals. And even those were very much only being carried out very often with male animals and male cell lines. And so that was meaning that, say it was a drug that was being studied, there are differences in how males and female humans respond to medications. And so potentially drugs that would be beneficial to women but not to men weren't even getting into human trials, because they weren't being identified as potentially useful because they were using male animals in early research. And so this is actually quite a significant problem, which was recognised. And we had various bodies saying, no, you actually do need to include female animals and female people in medical research. It's only fairly recently that happened, only within the last 20 years. But now we've got research bodies saying, don't collect data on sex.
Just don't even touch sex at all?
They'll say, don't collect it unless you absolutely have to. And like there are some areas where it would be absolutely clear, and that sort of hard sort of research around drug development, they're still going to be collecting, they'll still be including males and females in research, so that won't change. But some other areas, so for example, like we know that the pandemic has impacted men and women differently around how they've lived their lives, and that particularly for women who've got children, who've very often they've been the ones who've been responsible for remote schooling, when schools were in lockdown, and also trying to work, and also always, even prior to the pandemic, more engaged in, household tasks. So you've got women who have been absolutely just slammed very often, and their work has suffered and their careers have suffered because of this. And yet, I've been asked to be in two different bits of research, or two bits of research have come my way where I've thought, I'll just see how, what questions they are asking here around the impact of the pandemic. And neither of them asked for my sex. And it's just like, how is this ethical to actually conduct research when we know, just anecdotally, that there's been a difference in how the pandemic has impacted men and women, not to actually ask this question. And it comes from, I think, I think there's just a lot of confusion in research, but there's people are wanting to be kind. They're not wanting to ask people questions that they might find confronting, and they're worried about being called transphobe or bigoted or something, and so there's some avoidance happening there. But I don't think this helps transgender people either. And I don't know.
How does it not?
I don't know if you actually read our paper, and we had a very large supplementary file that went with it that included a lot of examples of the sorts of issues and problems and miscommunications that can happen when you inappropriately desex language. So our sort of basis with our paper was to say, sex is not important. The sex of somebody is not important all the time. But when it's important, and we were talking specifically about female reproduction, so we would argue that anything to do with female reproduction, the sex of the person is actually very central to this, that sex language actually makes things clear. If you desex it, then it makes things confusing, and there's a whole heap of issues that can happen there. But one of the examples that we have in our paper was a study, I think it was done in Canada, it might have been the US. It was actually on pregnancy involvement with transgender young people. And pregnancy involvement was either getting pregnant or getting someone pregnant.
Okay.
And they were looking at, what were their experiences of this, and specifically what were their, how did this impact their mental health? But they didn't collect data on sex or disaggregate by sex. And there is a vast difference between getting someone pregnant.
Oh, come on.
And
no,
getting
there's not.
pregnant.
There's not really. It's all a social construct, right?
Well, you can treat it that way, but that's not helping anybody, And so I would think, for somebody who is trans and who has particular experiences around their body, that getting pregnant might be something that's quite challenging for them and might have an impact on their mental health. But if you're not collecting data to be able to identify that, then that is not serving them well at all.
Oh, man. That's a whole other question. Is it ethical? Is it medically ethical?
Well, no, that should not have passed through the ethics committee without question.
Well, I was just thinking, is it ethical to be on testosterone if you're pregnant as a woman, to be taking supplements?
I think the general recommendation is that you don't. But but trans men have unknowingly gotten pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a lot of, I guess, bodies that are trying to raise awareness that simply taking testosterone isn't a form of contraception, and that if you are engaging in heterosexual sex and you're female and you may be taking testosterone, you may not be having a period. That doesn't preclude pregnancy, and so there is, sort of campaigns and sort of targeted information being shared to let people know about that. But generally speaking, it's not considered a good idea to be taking testosterone while pregnant. And I don't know that we know what the outcomes will be for the child when that occurs.
I don't think we have anywhere near the sample of that. No. We don't even have the significant data on transition as it is, let alone transition during pregnancy.
No. I mean, we don't know. We don't know whether there might be a carry-on too. If you've been
what do you mean a carry-on?
Well, so if you've been taking testosterone, so when an infant is born, a female child is born, they actually already have all of the eggs that they're ever going to have is inside of them. So somebody who is taking testosterone, a female who's taking testosterone, that will be having an impact probably on those eggs inside their body.
Testosterone, from what I've read, is a pretty powerful drug. And it wiggles into all sorts of places, just kind of like the male sex. We just kind of get into places. Of course, the eggs are going to be exposed to it. So I don't. Is anybody even asking that question?
I haven't looked to see. I imagine that people will be. There will be people who will be interested in finding out what's going on there. So it is. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the potential impact could be, but you could imagine that there might be, and it's certainly something that's worth looking at. And it's, and I guess it's something that should be considered as a part of any consent process when a female is considering taking testosterone.
Such as they are. They're just like, here's a pamphlet. I mean, how much more fine print are you going to tack onto these things? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I think these things are dealt with differently in different places.
Yeah.
But I think, absolutely that should be one of the things that is raised. We don't have the information, but I think it should be to know absolutely what the impact might be. But I think that we should be letting people know that there may be an impact, so that then they're at least making the decisions on the having had the opportunity to consider that there might be one. Yeah.
So how has the change in gendered language impacted your field and your wheelhouse? Is it just extra steps, or is it forming an actual block in the development of information specifically about breastfeeding and infant rearing, or is this a very first world problem, so you get to run away from the first world problem and go help third world or the other worlds?
No, this is what kind of was a very strong impetus for me to actually gather together some colleagues and write this paper. And that's because, I'm sorry here, but I'm going to be having a little bit of a go at the US and US organisations.
Yeah.
The US is very influential culturally around the world. Very influential in terms of so many of our international organisations are based in the US. And that has a massive impact. Funders are based in the US as well. And so, the funding is coming from the US, the pressure to change language is coming from the US without a consideration of how that might play out. And so again, over the pandemic, as I mentioned, one of my areas is infant and young child feeding in emergencies. And so I've been very busy over the last 2 years or so dealing with stuff to do with the pandemic, because an infectious disease epidemic of any kind is actually a real challenge for health providers and for mothers, because your normal process in an infectious disease epidemic is that you separate the people who are infected from the people who are uninfected to stop them from getting infected, stop the disease from spreading. But what do you do when the infected person is a mother and she has a newborn and she's infected and the baby is not? Do you separate them? Do you prevent breastfeeding? And we've had, quite our history with this has not been particularly good, particularly with HIV. So when HIV first arose in the 80s and 90s, in countries like the US and Australia, this was a disease that predominantly infected homosexual men. But in Africa, this was actually a disease that predominantly impacted heterosexual people. And in some countries, 30% or more of pregnant women were HIV positive. And it is possible for HIV to be transmitted via breast milk. And so there was this quandary: what do we do? Do we support breastfeeding and risk the infant becoming infected with HIV? Or do we recommend that mothers who are HIV positive not breastfeed? And initially, that was what they came up with as the recommendation. They were like, HIV is a terrible disease. We don't want any infants to get it through breastfeeding. And so we will recommend that mothers who are HIV positive not breastfeed. And in some countries, they were supplying women with infant formula. But as I mentioned to you earlier, breastfeeding is actually really important to infant health. This is a tissue that babies are getting initially, in their body. It's helping their own immune system to develop. It contains multiple ingredients that help to prevent and fight infection. If infants don't have this, they are much more likely to become ill with infections. And in many parts of the world, diarrhea and respiratory tract infections, they kill babies on a regular basis. And so those recommendations with HIV to prioritise prevention of transmission over looking at overall risk actually resulted in the deaths of many thousands of infants. And recommendations swung back around to actually say, if a woman is HIV positive, in a resource-poor setting, it's highly likely that it is going to be safer for her baby if they are exclusively breastfed than to be infant formula fed. So we got it wrong. We got it badly, badly wrong in the 90s and the early 2000s with HIV. So when COVID came around, we were kind of faced with a similar sort of issue. If a woman has COVID-19, should she be separated from her baby? Or should they be supported to be kept together and breastfeeding encouraged? And the World Health Organization got it right from the very beginning. They recommended that if mothers had COVID, that they keep their babies close by them day and night, that they breastfeed them, that they essentially carry on as they would have otherwise, except for, wearing a mask, washing surfaces, that sort of thing, washing their hands. But some countries did not make that recommendation, and unfortunately the US was one of those countries that was initially quite keen on separating mothers and infants. And unfortunately, because the US is a very influential country, many other countries followed suit.
Okay. It's just the infant mortality of COVID is
very low.
infinitesimally
Yeah.
low. And even
Yes.
the
Yeah.
mortality rate of a healthy mother is really, really low.
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
could be the
Yeah.
case that children were robbed of necessary nutrients for a disease that wouldn't impact them at all. So they
That's
were
right.
more impacted by the recommendations.
Yes. Yes, that's right. The recommendations that were supposed to protect them were actually harming them. And so we had, yes, I've kind of spent 2 years railing against the US Centers for Disease
Oh,
Control.
how does one rail against the U.S. effectively? Do you have any tips?
If one is an academic, one writes papers.
Oh, okay.
So
How did those go over?
Quite well. So 3 so far. Another one that's under review at the moment. I really think that that organisations like the CDC need to take, if they're going to make recommendations like this, if they're going to prioritise, in my view, give an overweight priority in preventing transmission of infection at all costs. And not actually give sufficient weight to the importance of breastfeeding and maternal and infant proximity, that they need to actually mitigate against those recommendations being taken up elsewhere, and particularly in countries that are, have much less in the terms of resources. So
I've spoken about this on a theoretical level. And the challenges of, on a philosophical level, the challenges of certain assumptions with regard, within liberalism, broadly construed, about the individual and the individual rights and property rights and so on and so forth. We don't have to go into abortion. We completely avoid the abortion topic because that's a whole other topic. But a woman and an infant, let's say, are they one organism or two? And how do you conceptualize that? And how does conceptualizing that impact medical care?
absolutely, Benjamin, for somebody who is not working in health, you have absolutely, and not in this area at all, you have absolutely hit the nail on the head here. Because this was one of the issues that we really did face with COVID, is that a lot of systems wanted to consider a mother and infant as being separate, where a mother and a newborn infant are not entirely separate beings. Their physiologies and psychologies are linked. And so they can be physically separated, but there is a large cost to that for both of them. And it can play out, in the long term. So even separating a mother and infant in the first few days after birth has a large impact on the ability of particularly vulnerable women to provide good enough care to that child in the long term.
That linkage that will
Yes.
survive the lifetime of the child is not rooted, especially if there's other stresses in the environment.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're, so there has been research that's been done with particularly vulnerable women who are, say young or have histories of, intergenerational trauma, that sort of thing, and found that, if you separate the mother and the baby, so if the baby goes in the hospital nursery, which they used to have a lot of, 40 years ago, but still do in some places. And so if they're separated just for those few days, look at the situation 2 years down the track, and those mothers and infants who are separated are much more likely to be in situations where actually the infant or the young child then is not in the care of the mother anymore. The child's in foster care or in care of somebody else, versus when you kept the mother and infant together immediately from birth. And so that's sort of those environments that you provide early on. So skin-to-skin contact, early initiation of breastfeeding, rooming in, so the mother and the infant are close together in the same room in the days after birth. Those things are really very important for the mother and for the child, and particularly when you've got a vulnerable mother and infant. So, yeah. So it's, the dyad, as we talk about the mother-infant dyad. So they're not entirely separate. They are obviously separate individuals, but they are interconnected, and they should be treated, they should be taken into consideration when you're working out how to deal with them. So, yeah. So we had lots of problems with COVID.
Well, the COVID reveals, or puts a stress on our theories or ideas of the world. And especially with this dyad, I really do think that Western philosophy, and maybe not so much certain forms of Western religion, but Western philosophy is really missing out on a huge insight into the human condition by, one, being written mostly by males, but really not deeply considering the process of being born and the process of those first weeks, first months, first years that women are intimately connected with, and that all of our society, our entire species is founded upon. It's founded upon that. It's not founded upon a man being woken up in a garden. It's found by a baby waking up in the arms of a mother, and that little turn, it has huge implications, but we don't need to get into the weeds there. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting, and it's why, I think it's partly why sort of mainstream feminism has had real difficulties with motherhood, because it challenges that sort of, I think a lot of feminism has tried to consider that that women are the same as men, and that their needs are the same. And that's
but
actually...
their values are the same too.
Well, their experiences are the same. And you can, I think, probably maintain that until a woman has a baby. And then things are different. And I know, you're really into discussions around equity, that that's one of your most favourite words.
Do Australians know what sarcasm is, and are you deploying it right now, or am I misreading it?
Sorry, I forget that your sense of humour might be a bit different. One of the challenges that we're facing with this idea of equity becoming more prominent is that, if you're talking about infants, we should not be aiming for sex equity in infant care. We shouldn't see it as a goal to have the primary caregivers of newborns be equally male and female.
Oh, yeah. I don't think anybody's asking for that, but yeah.
Oh, I don't...
Oh, really?
Well, no.
Are they?
Well, yeah. Well, yes. Again, you're in the US, one of the very few countries in the world not to actually have any maternity leave for women. But in other parts of the world, including in my country, they're really ramping up the idea that we need to have, so at the moment we've got, I think it's 4 months paid, government paid at minimum wage maternity leave, or it's actually parental leave, so either parent can take it. But it's like 95% or something taken by women, which I think is entirely appropriate. But a lot of people don't like that because they want women to be getting back to work sooner. So they're talking about bringing in a situation where there's equal leave for each parent.
And just give two people 2 months off and just speed up the process of child rearing.
What they're actually proposing is 6 months, 12 months parental leave, 6 months of which has to be taken by each parent.
Oh, why do they want to mandate this crap? Why can't they let people choose?
Yeah.
Forget. Sorry, this is my American.
Because women aren't making the right choice. Women are choosing to be with their babies.
Typical women.
So, I mean, they do in some countries. So in Sweden, they have 15 months paid parental leave, mm-hmm. and 3 months of that is reserved for each parent. And the remainder can be taken by either parent.
Okay.
So in practice, that means that women can have 12 months paid maternity leave, and the father or second mother can have 3 months, which can be taken up until the child's 3 years of age.
Yeah.
I mean, that's great. Like, that gives lots of flexibility. And it's not, women do then have the choice to be with their infant for the whole of their infancy, for the whole of their first year. That's right. They can manage it how works best for them. But no, there are people that are wanting sex equity in infant care, and that would be something that I would not support.
Well, the other side of the equity topic is that the different cultural groups, the outcomes of these different metrics in America, we have all these different melting pot kind of thing, but we disaggregate the data and they say that this group over here is not having the same outcomes as that group over there. And it really, maybe I should try to phrase this as a question, but we're trying to make these close these disparity gaps when the kid is 18 or 20, right? In college, we're trying to even the things out in college. Those first 18 or 20 months,
yes,
are they not incrementally or exponentially more impactful on the outcome of the individual and then therefore their culture than year 18, year 20?
I mean, if you're talking about, in some of my work, as I mentioned to you, do work in to do with childhood trauma and foster care, out-of-home care. And, one of the things that I do from time to time is I'll actually be asked to write an expert report for court where there's a woman who's breastfeeding and there's concerns about the well-being of the child. And so child protection authorities are involved. And, I'll write a report to make sure that breastfeeding is actually considered in the decision-making, that this is actually a strength of this relationship. All the other stuff, whatever the other issues might be, whether there's concern about neglect or drug use or whatever it is, that's actually not my remit. I don't talk about that. But I do talk about what's going on for this mother and infant and the impact of separating them if they haven't been separated, or the impact of termination of breastfeeding if the woman has maintained her lactation and her child's in foster care. That is absolutely on that basis, that what you're doing now is important. And so, what I will say, one of the things I will say in this report is that if your child protection intervention results in this woman ceasing breastfeeding, then you have increased the likelihood, you have undermined this mother's capacity in providing care, and you have increased the likelihood that that child may experience abuse or neglect in the future. So you need to be supporting this here, if you can, in a way that keeps the child safe while you work out what needs to be done in the long term.
Yeah.
So that early intervention, and, I would take it back to the stuff that I was saying before. We're talking about in the minutes after birth, what happens then has an impact on the trajectory. And so if a woman if she's experienced abuse and neglect in her childhood, if she has a history of drug abuse, or domestic violence, or whatever it is that has made her vulnerable to having challenges in caring for her child, anything that you can do to support her early on, and especially anything that you can do to support her when she has her first baby, is likely to yield quite significantly into the future. And for that child, because we have this intergenerational trauma where sometimes there's families where, for 4 or 5 generations, the children have been in out-of-home care. They've been removed from the care of their parents because of inadequate care, abuse or neglect. Mm-hmm. And it just keeps, the cycle repeats. You've got to break it. Can't keep doing the same thing. It's not getting fixed.
This is, I don't know why I'm going to ask this. It's probably an impossible question, or I'm not going to phrase it kindly, meaning I'm not going to give you an easy question here, but it's just something I'm thinking about. Is there a therapeutic aspect of this first year for the mother? We understand conceptually that the child can't exist without the mom, but you have pointed to the impact and the meaning or the power of the relationship from the mother to the child, and how things change for the woman in that process. I'm wondering, even if it's just anecdotal or personal, if there...
Does it change you having a baby?
Well, does it change you, but is there an impact on the trajectory of the woman, her psyche, and is there other things? Is there things that are being rewritten in the woman by participating in this foundational relationship?
Can be.
Yeah.
Yes, and so there is some research around, so becoming a parent. So if you have a history of interactions with the justice system and you may have been incarcerated, if you become a mother, you're much less likely to end up back in jail. If you're becoming a father and you're living with your child, you're also less likely to end up in prison again.
And is that about sentencing or about the actual crimes that are being committed, or the
No, that's about it. I mean, I talked to you. You asked me, how did I end up doing this work? And I said, well, I had a baby. It is a life-changing event for women, and so it is a time where, if there are particular challenges, it can set women on a more positive trajectory. So for them, it can be a very, very positive thing, and for their child too, obviously, if they're able to do that. But we don't tend to. The system often just doesn't work to actually do that. Very often it is more undermining than supportive for these, for really vulnerable women who are having babies. I think the things that happen in the child protection system, the things that happen in the justice system, they're systems, they're institutions, and they don't work very well with people.
Yeah.
And particularly when you've got, like I say, this dyad, they don't work particularly well with this dyad.
Yeah, they're not set up. Well, they're machines, and though there's all these functions, all these mechanisms that are going on within the body of the woman and the body of the child during this process, they add up to something that's vastly superior in complexity to our institutions. That our institutions, it's like oil and water. I don't know how they would ever actually be able to conceptualize that or treat that correctly, especially if we don't have education of the people, for the people who are running these systems, to understand the profundity of the processes involved in childbirth and rearing.
Yeah.
So having a baby changed your professional life, but are there any insights that you got or received?
I highly recommend it.
Oh, really? Okay. You're pro propagation?
Well, if you want to, I'm not saying that this is something that everybody should do. But I do, I found it to be very, rewarding, and I think it's, I think we, generally speaking, I mean, this is another sort of reflection of a sexist society. We don't value the work that is involved in caring for children, and caregiving in general is undervalued. And so, I think that's something that, like there's many good things about being a mother, but one of the things that I think for many women they find difficult is that caregiving role that they have undertaken with their children is not valued by society, not valued in Western sort of capitalist society.
Big question. I spent 15, 20 years working as a preschool teacher, so just my bank account alone would reflect your sentiment. But I mean,
we talk a lot about how important it is to, nurturing the future generation and all that sort of thing. But it doesn't. It's not reflected in the things that we see as being important, and money is part of that.
Yeah. It's not a material good. It's a human good, and our systems of reward, broadly speaking, value the surface. They value the material. They don't value the human. And to reconfigure our systems of reward to value the human, that's a huge project, because it calls into question, well, what is actually human? What is a woman? What is a man? What is mothering? What is giving birth? What is fathering? And then if we don't have, back to the topic of the day, if we don't have gendered language and all of that's just a bunch of stereotypes that we need to dismantle constantly, then we can't even make headway into asking these very pertinent questions. How do we reward mothers? How do we value them? How do we undervalue them? Do they want more statues? Or do they want a paycheck for having babies? And where does that paycheck come from? And do we want just a bureaucratic apparatus extracting resources from the male through all these bureaucrats and then into the female? I mean, that's what when...
Yeah.
That's another question.
I'm not an economist.
Who's going to redistribute the resources? It's just a lot of questions, so...
I just realised, Benjamin, that I didn't actually get to the end of the point about why, my concern about the language stuff.
Yeah.
I talked about the pandemic and about how we were seeing mothers and infants separated in numbers that we've never seen before around the world. But what we were seeing sometimes from our health professional organisations and from others was language that was not clear. So speaking of, not separating parents and infants. And actually, it doesn't matter to a newborn baby whether they're separated from their father. It's irrelevant to them, but it matters vastly to them if they're separated from their mother. And there is that need to be specific. And we were seeing, avoidance of, even in policy. So infants that were in neonatal nurseries or neonatal intensive care units because they were ill, where access to those infants was being restricted, but policies were framed around parents. So one parent per day can be with the infant, or one parent can spend 2 hours with the infant, and not an appreciation that actually this was not, that it actually mattered both disproportionately to the mother, but absolutely to the infant, whether their mother was able to be with them or not. And I guess it just really highlighted, first of all, how we were getting this pressure to change language that was coming from, largely the US. But the organisations, our international organisations that are based in the US, were saying this. And the impact was being disproportionately affected, received in other places where mothers and infants were more vulnerable. I mean, it's also having an impact in the US. I mean, what happened over the pandemic in the US with mother-infant separation was just appalling. But, that this was being imposed on other places in the world just made me furious.
And added to that, it was obfuscated by the language that was being used. So
by the language, exactly.
This wasn't...
If we're in the middle of the pandemic and it's an emergency, it's a pandemic, and we can't clearly enunciate who this person is, who is vitally important to the infant, this is just crazy. And I don't think that people are trying to do anything bad. Largely,
okay. As long as there's a caveat.
Not the people. Well, no, not the people within these organisations that that I've been communicating with and dealing with. They're not. But I think they hadn't necessarily thought through all of the implications. Mm-hmm. And they hadn't. It is always a struggle. Dealing with these international organisations based in the US, that it's so US dominated, just kind of understanding that things are different in other parts of the world, and that in having the organisation based in the US, there is an added responsibility to ensure that you are not imposing your culture and your practices and your beliefs and your priorities on other parts of the world.
Well, what if ours are the best?
Well, apparently so, Benjamin. It seems that many people think that. But those same people will talk a lot about, colonialism and how bad it is.
Hypocrisy it's not double speak or a double standard if it's us. Right? No.
Well, it's a challenge.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I appreciate your work and the insight that you've graced me with. I'm not a woman, which brings me to my final question. Could you define a woman for me?
Would you like a gendered meaning or a sexed one, Benjamin?
The fun one. Which is the more fun
one?
Yeah, which one's more fun?
I don't know about fun. I mean, I think, like I say, I think they're useful in different places.
Okay,
but in places where where people have gender identities where that's important to them, they would say that they're a woman if their gender identity is that of a woman. Yeah. But if you're looking at the sexed meaning, then a woman is someone who's an adult and who is of the female sex. I don't think it's that hard. I don't know why that can't be said.
There's implications.
Well, there are, but it's important. If it wasn't important, then nobody would be asking. And that's why they're asking. It's not to be cruel. It's not to be mean. It's not to blow dog whistles. It's not to be politically aligned. Well, I would say
it has become that.
Times.
It has become that. But we need to separate that, especially when there's actual implications. Just with what we covered here tonight and other issues, sports and so on and so forth.
But I would say to you, actually, because I've found this in talking to people in the US and Canada, you have the political implications in the US and Canada that just do not exist in other places. So when, I have this conversation, nobody is thinking, oh, that's part of the religious right, because we don't have a religious right.
That's true.
It's not something that we have, and it doesn't exist in the UK either. And yet we have, lots of people from the US and Canada assuming a lot of things that are just don't have a basis, because it's different in different parts of the world. So there you go.
There you go. Karleen, you're doing excellent work. Do you have Do you have resources that you would like to share for anybody who wants to learn more or help out, or what's some of your organizations you'd like to plug? Or
Well, I'd love for people to read and share our paper.
okay,
So it's in Frontiers in Global Women's Health is
I
the
will
journal.
link that in the description. It's very tightly written, and there's a lot of citations.
There's a lot of citations, and supplementary file 1 shows you why we wrote it, and you know that this is not from bigotry. This is because there's actually an issue that needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. But read it, send it to your doctors, send it to your friends, spread it around. We hope that it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell people what to do. It raises what some of the concerns are. Ask some questions for people to consider when they're using language for themselves. And, you know, we hope it's just, I guess, empowering, giving people some tools. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and continue the discussion.
Yes.
Because that's what we need to do. We can't find solutions if we don't talk.
That's why we're here this evening, or this morning for you. It's tomorrow morning, right? What time is it?
It's 12:30 p.m. So this afternoon.
Tomorrow afternoon. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining me. I'll end the recording now. You want to say goodbye to the folks at home?
Goodbye. I hope you liked the conversation.